As the Second World War ended, tensions between the USSR and US began to increase. The Soviet Union, in an attempt to gain strength and allies, aided the Chinese Communist Party that formed in China in the early 1900s. Support for communism grew, and it was noticed that China reported a dictatorial suppression of dissent in nationalist-controlled areas. These undemocratic policies, combined with wartime corruption, made the Republic of China vulnerable to the communist threat. The Kuomintang heavily opposed the idea of having communism in China, and as a result, conflict began between the two parties. Mao Zedong spread his ideology of a people's nation to other adjacent Asian countries. The Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union created a heavy contribution to China's divide. Due to being manipulated heavily throughout its modern growth from European nations as well as Japan, China was in a dire need of finding a political system that would work and be supported by its people. After winning the war, the Chinese Communist Party demonstrated a working version of a nation that was able to support communism in Asia. Laos and Vietnam were influenced to join in order to gain favor with both the USSR and CCP, which were prominent figures in decolonized Asian countries. By creating pressure and tension between political parties in former colonial nations, the USSR and US's conflict spread into China and Southeast Asia. In order to understand how the Hmong were involved in the Secret War, people need to understand who the Hmong are. The Hmong are an ethnic group that live within Southeast Asia, with a large majority living in Laos. The Hmong did not associate themselves with other ethnic groups often, and were able to live independently without any major trade. They lived off farms in the mountains of Laos, and were an agricultural-based ethnic group. As the Cold War moved into Asia, the United States wished to prevent communism from spreading within Asia. Once civil war broke out in Laos, Vang Pao had grown concerned that the Hmong were likely to suffer reprisals from the communists because of the Hmong's previous close association with the French. As a result, he would associate himself heavily with the United States in order to protect his own interests for the Hmong. Under the command of the CIA and James W. Bill Lair, General Vang Pao would recruit and organize a guerrilla force for the United States in order to combat communist influences in Southeast Asia. The United States armed thousands of Hmong guerrilla fighters in Laos to fight in ground warfare and to rescue downed American pilots. During the capture of a strategic point north of Luang Prabang, the Hmong suffered heavy losses. 1,000 men, including commanders, were lost after the Vietnamese offensive. Because of these losses, the Hmong were forced to resort to recruitment of almost any able-bodied person within their clans. So, 30% were between the ages of 10 and 14, 30% were 15 and 16, while the remaining 40% were all over 35. Anybody between these ages were already dead. The CIA's reliance on the Hmong was so strenuous, it negatively affected their population during the war. After continuous pressure by the NVA and Pathet Lao, during the rainy season of 1969, Vang Pao abandoned the use of guerrilla tactics and launched a major offensive against the NVA and Pathet Lao forces. Vang Pao's offensive allowed the secret army to push communist forces past the Plain of Jars and capture heavy weaponry and 25 Soviet PC-76 tanks. They were also able to gain access to 1,700 tons of food and 2,500 tons of ammunition. However, the victory didn't last long, because in January 1970, the North Vietnamese army brought in 2 divisions that quickly regained all of their lost ground and threatened the major Hmong base at Long Tieng. These constant battles over PDJ territory resulted in a tug-of-war between the Hmong and NVA and Pathet Lao. Unfortunately for the Hmong, the communist forces would come out victorious, resulting in the withdrawal of American forces in Laos and other Southeast Asian countries. With the war in Laos and Vietnam ending on the 27th of January 1973, the Paris Agreement on Vietnam was concluded, providing for the withdrawal of American troops. Once the war ended, many Hmong families became displaced and sought refuge. Hmong troops would end up mostly abandoned by the US. Once the Secret War came to a close, the United States removed its presence within Laos and Southeast Asia. The US government had only returned with 3,000 high-ranking Hmong refugees, leaving the rest to sort themselves out in Laos and failing to take responsibility for the issues caused by an American influence. The Hmong were persecuted by communist forces and were forced into living in refugee camps across Thailand as a consequence to the United States' actions. Upon arrival, the Hmong were treated with discrimination alongside other minority ethnic groups. Although the war had ended, many Hmong tribesmen passed in the Thai camps. Over time, the Hmong would be able to seek refuge outside and into the United States. President Jimmy Carter signed the Refugee Act of 1980, and, with the new act, the government increased the annual refugee ceiling from 17,400 to 50,000 for 1980 to 1982, and created a systematic process to review and adjust the refugee ceiling during emergencies. By creating this response, the US government allowed more Hmong individuals to find safety in the States. As new immigrants, the Hmong would find themselves sponsored by individual, private, and church organizations during resettlement. However, the Hmong felt that because the churches sponsored and aided them, it seemed that the different religious beliefs would make them feel forced to attend church sessions with their sponsors. The Hmong people would feel like they'd be wronged to not follow their sponsors, but they were successfully, yet slowly, able to integrate into American society. Political success was provided by the influx of Hmong refugees in America. By creating the Refugee Act of 1980, President Jimmy Carter allowed for both more refugees to reach America after the Secret War, but he also allowed for many other refugees from other nations to seek asylum in the United States in later periods. This act allowed for continuous refuge in the United States. The Secret War and the CIA's influence and presence in Southeast Asia is still relevant today due to how it changed how the Hmong would live after the war. The Hmong that hadn't escaped were constantly persecuted and would never be able to go back to a life of self-sustainability. Many of the Hmong living in Laos were only able to survive due to donations from those that lived in the US. As a result, the Hmong of Laos were and still are impacted by the events of the Secret War. The events of the Secret War are still relevant today. It should be known that the individuals who fought for the United States' interests, despite not being connected to the US and CIA prior to the event, their actions should be recognized and given effort for reciprocation back.